people gathered on the steps of the Legislative Building in Olympia for the third week of nonviolent direct action for the National Poor People's Campaign. The Memorial Day gathering issued a challenge. They had a theme for that day, and it issued a challenge to the war economy, questioning unchecked war, militarism, and the war profiteering of what President Eisenhower back in the 50s had called the military-industrial complex. Speakers last Monday included members of Veterans for Peace and others who have suffered the after effects of war, whether it's PTSD or suicide of those they loved. People then walked 2 by 2 to Capitol Way, which actually is State Highway 99 that runs past our Capitol campus. Volunteers, including many clergy, engaged in a nonviolent act of civil disobedience by sitting in the roadway, blocking traffic. The rest of us gathered around saying, "Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live." Then the crowd moved toward the freeway, I-5, and protesters sat across the access. Police gave several orders to move, then arrested 17 protesters from blocking the entrance and removed them. The Poor People's Campaign began on Mother's Day last month, and it will continue until June 23rd, as people here in Washington State and in some 40 other states gather in weekly rallies committing acts of civil disobedience to protest federal and state policies that disproportionately affect poor people. And these rallies are all on the state capitol campuses around the country. They're led by the co-directors, the Reverend Dr. William Barber and the Reverend Liz Theoharis. The 2018, this year's Poor People's Campaign, is a revival of Dr. Martin Luther King's most radical project, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. Now, after successfully spearheading campaigns in the 60s that led to passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Dr. King began to focus on next steps. And despite the passage of important new laws, he knew that institutional racism, inequality, and injustice had not disappeared from the United States. He felt that the movement needed to broaden its targets from race-specific issues of segregation and Jim Crow, and to address the plight of the poor across racial lines, and demand full employment, guaranteed minimum income, and access to capital financing for small and minority businesses. Confronting militarism was also seen as an important part of King's Poor People's Campaign. But Dr. King's public position against the Vietnam War, which of course was raging in those years, was not popular with many civil rights activists, both black and white. And as we know, Dr. King was assassinated in April of 1968, just 50 years ago, before he could launch that phase of the Poor People's Campaign. Now, 50 years later, the Poor People's Campaign is reborn. The Reverends Barber and Theoharis met in 2013. Theoharis is a Presbyterian minister. She's a longtime justice organizer and advocate among domestic workers, Native Americans, and the homeless. She also is the co-director of the Union Theological Seminary, that's in New York, of their Kairos Center, in which poor people play key leadership roles. Barber is a Disciples of Christ minister, and he at that time was heading the NAACP in North Carolina, and he was also beginning the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina to protest that state's conservative legislative agenda. Now, Barber created a broad-based coalitions of Christians, Jews, Muslims, non-believers, blacks, Latinos, poor whites, feminists, environmentalists, and other activists who then began to show up every Monday in Raleigh, the state capital, to witness and protest restrictive state policies, especially those around voting rights. Together, Barber and Theoharis launched this new movement, the Poor People's Campaign, subtitled A National Call for Moral Revival. The campaign is dedicated to the idea that people should not live or die from poverty in the richest nation ever to exist. And in these dangerous and uncertain times in America, this revival could not be more urgent or more timely. Now, Dr. King had envisioned the original Poor People's Campaign as an expansion of the fight for civil rights against the indignities of poverty across all racial lines. And it included demands for federal and state living wages and so on. So 50 years later, poverty remains a central issue in America. Income inequality has grown. The poverty rate declined from 1968 through 1975, and then remained fairly steady, though it is higher now. The poverty rate is higher now than it was in 1975. And deep poverty has increased. According to the U.S. Census, 43 million Americans live in poverty. Dr. King would be appalled at current figures that show there are 140 million Americans who are either impoverished or so low income they're unable to routinely afford food, clothing, or utilities. And these are Americans who work hard and are above the federal poverty line, but who live paycheck to paycheck. So these are the people who experience a major financial crisis when a car breaks down or a child falls ill. Income equality has risen to pre-Great Depression levels. For America's rich, life is great. In fact, it's getting better. In 1980, so a number of years ago, the top 1% of the rich got 12% of the income. In 2014, that 12% jumped to 20% of all the income in America. The richest of the rich, the top 1%, did even better. Their income rose 636% in that same period. And corporate boards of directors apportion an excessive amount of pay to the top, even when the top bungles badly. We've read those stories. For example, the CEO at the clothing company, The Gap, made $15.6 million a year, 2,900 times the pay of the company's average worker. The board of directors decided that the Gap's CEO, Jeff Purwan, who by the way was fired earlier this year for poor performance, they decided he was more valuable than 2,899 employees all put together. That's one way income inequality is sustained and worsened. Today's Poor People Campaign focuses on and seeks to end policies and practices that punish the poor and reward the rich. And laws enacted at the state level have disproportionately affected poor people, including health care access, aid to very low-income families, and programs to help those leaving prison to re-enter their communities. Restrictive voting laws, like those Barber continues to protest in North Carolina, are especially targeted in this Poor People's Campaign. Now, here in Washington State, voting rights have been protected. Although every legislative session, I have seen bills introduced that seek to limit voter access and that, of course, they don't go anywhere, but nevertheless, the fact that these bills are introduced to limit voter access is a signal we cannot fail to be vigilant in protecting voter rights here in our state. Now tomorrow, Monday morning again, is the 4th week of the Poor People's Campaign in Olympia and in capital cities across the country. Tomorrow's gathering will focus on ecological devastation and health, particularly the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation on the poor. Speakers will include medical professionals and those outside the health care safety net, and they will be calling for expansion of the right to health and an expansion of our work for a healthy planet. They'll be demanding Medicaid for every state and the protection of Medicare and single-payer universal health care for all. Now, no doubt many of us as religious progressives support the goals of the Poor People's Campaign. Many of us have supported in our congregations and in groups we belong to in our communities, things like the single-payer health care, plans, better programs for those living in poverty, expanded access to the ballot, and end to racism, homophobia, religious bigotry, and climate change. So we attend rallies, we lobby our legislators, we clean up our beaches, we provide meals, and staff shelters for the homeless. So what makes the Poor People's Campaign different from what we are already doing? Well, thanks to the eloquence and the organizing skills of Reverend Barber and Reverend Theoharis, skills not unlike those possessed by Dr. King, the interrelatedness of all of these issues, racism, homophobia, poverty, all of these issues are interrelated. And the impact of those issues on all Americans are then linked and shown how they are connected to each other. And they're framed as moral issues that this country and our people cannot ignore. In April, at the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, Barber pointed out that we as a country spend a lot of time and energy commemorating the heroes and martyrs of the civil rights movement. But then he went on to tell those gathered there in Memphis that day for that commemoration that the duty of the living is not simply to recall the martyrs of the movement, but to continue their work. In his resonant baritone, Barber said, "We've got to hold up the banner until every person has health care. We've got to hold it up until every child is lifted in love. We've got to hold it up until every job is a living wage job, until every person in poverty has guaranteed subsistence." In Barber's world, politics and religion intersect. The concerns of religion are not distinct from social concerns, concerns like poverty and racial injustice. Barber brings a theological perspective to political points, often citing the prophetic voices in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. In North Carolina, after the Moral Mondays, he launched a movement called Repairers of the Breach, a movement that united labor activists, educators, and religious leaders and puts morality at the center of progressive activism. The still active movement, the Repairers of the Breach, was inspired by these words from chapter 12 in the book of Isaiah. "Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in." Isaiah's words in the Hebrew scriptures lifted up the responsibility and the hopes of those Judeans returning from their 70-year captivity in Babylon to the land laid waste by the Chaldean occupiers. All the remains of the Judeans' former prosperity had gone to decay, the country filled with ruins. But all this, said Isaiah, would be restored, and cities and towns would rise with their former beauty and magnificence if the Judeans would keep God's law. Well, similar responsibilities to repair the breach stand before us today as America faces a moral crisis. Barber's work in North Carolina shows his faith in the possibility of alliances of poor people across racial lines, of many religious traditions, alliances much like those formed by Dr. King in the 60s. This fusion coalition confronts many of the myths about poverty. Poverty has been so racialized, says Barber, that most people don't even know that in raw numbers, the majority of poor people are white. Well, Barber's conversations with Reverend Theo Harris led, as I said, to the formation of today's Poor People Campaign. They talked with many people in local communities that have been affected by poverty. He met with Apache activists in Arizona. He was in Aberdeen, meeting with unemployed loggers and mill workers. He met with disabled veterans, with people sitting in volunteer health clinics in large cities, with people in many faith communities across this country. And at each stop, Barber called upon people to listen to the voices of the poor and to build up a movement that addresses the suffering of people today by lifting up the leadership of the people most directly impacted, the poor themselves. So today, the Poor People's Campaign, 40 days of direct moral action, is focused on educating, organizing, and fusion coalition building around these diverse issues, around different geography and different groups. But this campaign is not going to stop when the 40 days end on June 23rd. These 40 days that are happening now, each Monday, are only the beginning of a long-term, non-violent, and they emphasize this is a non-violent campaign, a multi-year effort to unite the poor with others pushed aside by the current system, and challenge the interconnected evils of racism, poverty, ecological devastation, homophobia. What does this mean for those of us, Unitarian Universalists, participating in the 40 days of direct action in Olympia or in other state capitals? And for those of us in our congregations, how can we be active participants allied with others? Well, last Monday, I asked myself that question as I returned home that evening and reflected upon my day at the Capitol. What did it mean for me to be there? Now, my experience of living in Olympia is that the people there are generally committed to being in dialogue with one another across divides. I wondered, as did several other people I talked to, about the efficacy of, as the campaign asked, taking back the people's house by sit-ins in the legislative building. Our legislature isn't in session. So we're not educating lawmakers or taking back the building from anyone. And I might say during the sit-in period on the streets, the ever-polite Olympia police force, at least to our predominantly white middle-class group, actually provided an escort for the protesters and redirected traffic around us. And actually they had to be pushed to arrest the protesters. As others asked me, what do the arrests serve? Well, these are good questions to ask about any public witness in which we participate. Not just witness, but protests in which we're challenged, especially the law enforcement officers. Now, upon reflection last Monday evening, I acknowledged that my experience that day would not necessarily be that of others. The poor, the homeless, the people of color. That my encounters with law enforcement are largely the result of the officer's perceptions of my whiteness, my age, and yes, I was wearing a clerical collar that day, so that appeared also. I was a person from a church. And there's that privilege we've talked about. There it is, right in my own life. Next, I had to realize that I had to let go of my expectations of how things should proceed. Yes, I grew somewhat impatient when 2 o'clock arrived, the beginning of the rally. Then 2:30 arrived, and the rally had not yet begun. Now, when the speakers did begin, I was inspired by their personal stories. And when they ended, and we moved from the Capitol steps, I, of course, wanted to know where exactly we're going. We weren't giving kind of a game plan. This is going to happen next, that sort of thing. I wanted to know where we were going and what would happen there. I like being given an agenda, preferably with goals bullet pointed, and very specific goal steps and goals to follow. But that was not to be. I was just one of the crowd, and I went with the crowd. And I realized that this is what following the leadership of others means, especially those impacted by poverty, and last Monday by those impacted by this country's war economy. This was not my event to plan or orchestrate. It was not going to proceed according to how I wanted it to proceed. My role last Monday was showing up at 2 o'clock that Monday afternoon in Olympia, bringing with me a cadre from the Olympia congregation. It meant showing up for the mother who did not have gas money to drive to Olympia from Bremerton or Seattle, who did not have child care for her 2 preschoolers. It meant showing up for the man cleaning motel rooms who could not afford to take time off and lose a day's wages. It meant showing up for that veteran living in a homeless camp in Seattle. My role meant that I showed up. And it meant showing up because I am a person who can drive to the Capitol and spend 4 hours listening to people talk about lives devastated by war, by poverty, by racism. As someone who, because of my race, because of the circumstances of my family life and privileges that were not given to me and I did not earn, but that I brought with me that day, that I could and I should show up. My role was showing up and standing there, yes, uncertain as about exactly what I would be doing for the next 3 or 4 hours, and let others lead me. To sing, to march, to chant, and to show up again tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m. on the Capitol steps, and then to show up the next Monday, and in fellowship with other justice seekers from labor unions, from churches, from our temples, from our mosques, to be with them, to keep challenging those interconnected evils of a system that allows racism, poverty, and ecological devastation to exist in this country. I'm there to be grateful for the leadership that has brought me to this place and this time to stand with others committed to shifting the moral narrative in this country. To do all I can do as an individual, as a member of my religious community, and as a citizen of this country, to collaborate with others, to bring about a moral revolution in America that brings this country back to the values expressed in our faith traditions and in the Constitution of the United States of America. And so may it be. I invite you to stand. If you're willing and able, let's sing together